All right. Welcome to WTF Is Up. I'm Jeremy.
And I'm Omar.
We're two dads, entrepreneurs, former tech execs, and best-selling authors who are here to help you figure out WTF is up in the world, and most importantly, UTF you can actually do about it. Now, if you listened to our episode last week, you know that we are hardcore nerds when it comes to entrepreneurship. And Omar, how did we get into this whole entrepreneurial world in the first place? What was some of our gateway drugs that got us started?
Well, I think first of all, we came up in Silicon Valley, so it's in the water, but we would often sit around and talk about things we could do together as co-founders, and we eventually did one. And you've done several, Jeremy. So that's what whet our appetite. And since then, I've been running one of the country's largest entrepreneurship centers within a university and gotten even more steeped in the field and some of the research, which we're excited to share with you today.
So we're going to get really deep into that in a moment. But just a reminder, today is part two on entrepreneurship. That's how deeply passionate we are about this topic. And as always, before we get into the good stuff, Omar, would you grace this episode with a dad joke?
All right. Okay. So you want to hear a joke about entrepreneurship?
Let's hear it.
You are going to have passive income and a shit ton of free time. That's the
Okay.
joke.
There you go. You got me there. I was like waiting with bated breath. And then I was like, wah, wah, that's my life.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, wait. How about this one? I have a great idea for a startup. It's a watch repair service. It's about
Ooh.
time.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. That definitely fits squarely in the genre of dad joke dumb. So beautifully done.
Thanks.
Okay, Omar, before we get into all the things that we teed up last week, talking about venture capital, talking about AI and entrepreneurship, what are some of the big frameworks, the ways of breaking down this really complicated world that we can use to think about how entrepreneurship works and the times that it doesn't?
Yeah. So I think it's really helpful to just think about the frameworks a little bit and what some of the research says about successful entrepreneurship, because this is actually a discipline unto itself that has some knowledge base. And I promise, as Jeremy said, we're going to get practical and tactical too, right? We always want to do that. So, Jeremy, the first and main framework that I just want to talk about is something called effectuation. And this exists in the Darden School of Business, where I work, and it's the brainchild of a professor named Saras Sarasvati. And what she did was study many decades ago, but this has been repeated by many, many studies since, cited often. She studied how do successful entrepreneurs think. And like I said, the seminal study that she did has been replicated many times. And the fundamental premise that we start from is that the future is unknown, right? We are all living in highly uncertain times, probably more so than ever, right? So the future is unknowable, uncertainty abounds, goals are ambiguous, information is isotropic, meaning everybody has access essentially to the same information. You can't find a competitive advantage by having better information, right? I don't know, unless you're like insider trading or some shit. So her fundamental question is, how can I control a future that I cannot predict? So, Jeremy, thoughts on that framing before I tell you what the research says?
Yeah, no, I think that is the definitive leap of faith that is entrepreneurship, right? We
Exactly.
want to be able to control the future, and yet it feels so unknowable. So tell us more.
Exactly. So, so rather than spending cycles trying to predict something that's inherently uncertain and impossible to predict, let's just start there. How do we exert control in our world, do some stuff that we actually are excited about that might actually work, right? And there's 5 key principles to this framework of effectuation. The first is called bird in hand. The idea here is you focus on your means versus your goals, right?
Mm.
Create something new with your existing means instead of trying to waste time discovering new ways to achieve some amorphous goal, right? So
So
what are
what's an example of that, Omar? Just bring it to life a little bit for us.
so what are my birds in hand? So Jeremy, for our business, our birds in hand were, we had an unfair advantage when it came to knowledge about LinkedIn because we had worked there. We had worked with colleges and college students on how to use LinkedIn. Our birds in hand were not just our knowledge there, it was our unique network in that area. And we had both gone to business schools where we piloted our curriculum, right? So we had access to those customers, those were our birds in hand. So we didn't start from a place of, hey, Jeremy, let's do a startup. What could we do? We started from a place of, hey, we know this stuff. We know these people. Maybe there's a business here, right?
I love that. You can contrast that with like, the classic thing of self-driving cars are super sexy. Let's start a self-driving car startup, knowing the first thing about software or about cars. And I love that idea of starting with strengths.
Exactly, exactly. And we talked in the last episode not just about product market fit that everyone talks about, but founder market fit, right? So starting from your birds in hand and really interrogating what are those things that I have already, my means. And I guarantee you, um, even if you've not been to college or you are 16 years old listening to this, you have more birds in hand than you realize, right? You have people in your life, you have people who know people, you have some skills you could learn. So you always have more than you think. And this, I think, is just an accessible way to talk about entrepreneurship because really anybody can do something. And I will tell you, when we're working with college students, we get a lot of startups that are like, about their experience in college, right? We need a better way to register for classes. We need a better way to find apartments to live in. That's great. That is great because they're innovating what they know, where they know.
Okay, so that's number one. What's
Okay,
number
that's
two?
principle number one. Principle number two, affordable loss. We touched on this last time, right? Instead of trying to maximize your upside, think about minimizing your downside and
Oh,
really think through and make a commitment in advance. What are you willing to lose versus trying to invest in calculations about potential returns to the project? This also, I think, is helpful for people to have the right motivation for getting into entrepreneurship, right? Because it's not about necessarily what can I make from this. It's I'm genuinely interested in one of two things which successful entrepreneurs need to be very interested in, which is either the problem or the audience, right? The customer segment, and ideally both, right? So
yeah.
affordable loss is focusing on the downside instead of the upside.
Well, let me give a real example because, as you know, I've been discussing with a small business development coach here in California the idea of starting an arcade or a karaoke lounge right in my hometown of Mountain View. And one of the first things she asked me is, are you prepared to lose half a million to $1 million? And as someone who had only done online businesses that cost maybe $1,000 to start up total,
Mhm.
I had never really thought about it from that perspective, but it did make it so real. So I really like that principle because I think we've got to get to that moment of clarity.
And that's an interesting thing we can come back to with tech businesses where maybe the cost to get started is so much lower. Maybe that means for you, yeah, I'm gonna go there instead of investing in a physical location that has a bunch of upfront costs. But think about what are you willing to lose? And then the third principle ties to this, which is Professor Sarasvati calls it the crazy quilt. How do I weave a crazy quilt of collaborators, co-creation, partnership, negotiating with any and all stakeholders who are willing to make actual commitments versus worrying about their opportunity costs or elaborate competitive analyses. Don't waste time on spreadsheets. Don't waste time on stealth mode and trying to protect your IP. You don't have shit until you have a huge, thriving business, a moat, right? As we call it in entrepreneurship, that's protectable. Most people who are starting a venture should be welcoming in as many possible collaborators as possible, as opposed to trying to protect that idea. I have news for you. Isotropic information world, your idea is not that great. I'm sorry. Most people have had the idea. Now you could do it better, but don't worry about protecting it. Think more about bringing people into that. And then the way that ties to affordable loss is bring them in at their affordable loss. When you're bringing
Oh,
people into your venture, and it might be the most unlikely suspects, right? People you wouldn't even think would necessarily be connected to this or know somebody who knows somebody or have a skill set that you could really use. Ask them as soon as possible and make those commitments up front. What are you willing to put into this? And related to that, what are you willing to lose? Jeremy, if I think back on like maybe some of our missteps as co-founders, I'm not sure we really had those conversations about what are we really willing to put into this and lose.
yeah. But I was just thinking about it in the context of this hypothetical arcade idea is that I really have been thinking about it as this like hero's journey of, oh, I've got to go out there and start a business to save downtown Mountain View. When in fact, I think the best entrepreneurs, as you indicated, are the ones who really build this small army of folks who are linking arms and going on this journey together. So
Yep,
definitely could use a reframe there on myself.
totally. This is
Okay, what's number
the reason
4?
I like this is because it's a reframe for a lot of people who are very
Yeah,
left-brained MBAs.
yeah,
The other thing that that's an acknowledgement of is you don't know everything, right? So
yeah.
good entrepreneurs strike this great balance between like humility and confidence, right? The fourth principle is the lemonade principle. And this is just leveraging contingencies, right? The bumps in the road are opportunities to learn and to grow, leverage those surprises. They're going to happen. It's obstacles are not things to avoid, overcome, or adapt. They are things to grow from. So it's kind of growth mindset. This is more of an overall orientation versus like a specific skill set, but that's an important thing. And then the last one is,
And actually, let me just pause for a
oh
moment,
yeah,
Omar, because I think it's so important to see these things in context. I remember the very first iteration of LinkedIn guys was not working with higher ed, but selling directly to consumers and to job seekers. And after spending all these hours building up this crazy masterclass, I think we sold like 7 copies in the first 30 days. And it was only from that massive failure that we pivoted to ultimately serving that same course to schools, and that opened the doors for opportunity. So you're absolutely right. I think everything seems great in retrospect, but at the time, recognizing that failure is not necessarily disastrous.
totally, totally. And you just have to have that orientation to like be willing. And this is what you just described is a tried and true thing that happens in every venture. Every venture has to make the pivot, right? Sometimes it's a 30-degree pivot versus a 180, but what you're describing is the pivot. And you can't make that unless you have the right mentality of learning, of growing, of, hey, I might be wrong. I have a fundamental bird in hand or multiple of those. But what I don't need to be so overly attached to is the way in which I'm doing it or who I'm doing it for. And then the last one is more of like their worldview, which is the pilot and the plane principle. And again, this is about control versus prediction, just fundamentally that humans have agency, we have creativity. That's what drives opportunity. Let's create the future that we want to live in instead of overly focusing on like exploiting factors that are outside of your control. Where is tech and AI headed? What's the trajectory of that? What are some macroeconomic trends? That is not worth spending your time on, right? What's happening in the job market, we can't control those things. So let's just have that orientation of we create the opportunity, that internal locus of control.
I love that. One of the things I'm sharing with job seekers and entrepreneurs today is when the world is so unlucky around you, the only source of luck is the luck that you create. And we have more power over that than we realize.
Yeah,
Okay, Omar, I got it. Yeah,
I think
go
it's
for it.
often misquoted, but, and I'll probably do it here, but I think Thomas Jefferson said something like, I'm a great believer in luck. And I find the harder I work, the more of it I have.
Yes. Yes. But I was just going to say, I have to be really honest, Omar. Before you shared this framework with me, I was already starting to roll my eyes a little bit like, here's another 5-step acronym that some academic created. That actually maps exactly on to what we've experienced, what I think every entrepreneur has experienced. And I'm just really impressed that I think she distilled it so beautifully down to these things that everyone's got to go on this journey of facing challenges, building out collaborators. And I think that's a really great place for folks to start.
Yeah, awesome. I'm glad you said that. So the reason I like this is because, as you said, it's more mindset. It's more descriptive based on how actual successful entrepreneurs think. She literally observed them versus like necessarily prescriptive. So the prescriptive framework that many people use, talk about, read about, teach in most schools that I just want to quickly reconcile this with is lean startup, right? And
Mm.
Jeremy, I think we were both acolytes of lean with our own startup and living in Silicon Valley. This is a framework that came out of tech and like people actually doing stuff did not come out of academia at all. And what's cool about it is I think it's a really great complement in many ways to the effectuation model I just described. So lean, just to boil it down, sort of build, measure, learn cycle. And I would say there's some things they have in common. Both of these frameworks emphasize quick tests, learning fast, learning as cheaply as possible, getting signal from actual customers, right? And both say traditional business plans are stupid as shit, right? But I think the build, measure, learn, they kind of start from slightly different places in terms of what to build.
Mm.
Lean kind of assumes that the answer is out there to be found. It's like the scientific method. You have to just like get the data, find the answer. That's not quite how the most successful entrepreneurs, studies show, think, right? They start where they're at. They recognize that they as we said, birds in hand, their skills, their passions, their networks, they're nerding out on problem they care about, nerding out on the customer segment. That's their competitive advantage. So if that lean is the scientific method, this is the entrepreneurial method, maybe as a different, contrast. And and whereas I think lean is very focused on predict, right? Identify a market opportunity, then test and pivot, repeat. Effectuation is much more about control in that unpredictable world. Identify what's doable for you, including what you're willing to lose, right? Minimize downside versus maximizing upside. Aggressively enlist partners, then course correct. And so like maybe you're so motivated by the potential upside that you're going to crush it in some random ass niche, but that's not usually the case for successful entrepreneurs, right? That's not how they start nor how they grow. They usually care really deeply about the thing they're trying to do, the problem they're trying to solve, or the customers are trying to solve it for. And that's the shift that I think is really important. Let's not overanalyze our way into some amazing market opportunity that nobody says and figure out the perfect product to meet that opportunity. Let's just start doing shit and make sure we're meeting some needs, start from what we know, who we know, and go from there.
Well, I love it. I'll just add that I think of all the startups or all the frameworks out there that kind of do get into those step by step processes, I really like lean because it's almost biological. Like my
Yeah.
daughter was asking me last night, why does this homework have to be so hard? And I say, well, the only way that you grow synapses in your brain is by actually challenging them. And in the same way that lean says, hey, you got to get out there into the world, you got to get real data, you have to be surprised and maybe even shocked by that data. That's how we grow as entrepreneurs. So it all comes back to the sort of foundational life force that drives us all.
Yeah, I love that. And I think I agree with you. I think lean is really good when you're in the process of building, right? Because you're iterating fast. And I would also add to this design thinking, which like we came up in that world as well, but more of like that 5 step approach of really interrogating what to build and how customers feel, even if they don't quite know they feel, which is empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test, right? It's almost like the how to do it within lean. That's really helpful once you're in the building phase. My point is just where do you start? And you got to start with a real visceral connection to what you're trying to do in the world and who you're trying to do it for. Then you can go off and build. But Jeremy, I think both of us have been in tech companies, the big tech companies, where things have been built without making sure there was a real need there, right? And what happens to those products or ventures? Just like we know most ventures fail, most product launches fail, even where tech companies have huge customer bases. Google is really happy with a 5% success rate on new product
Wow.
launches, and they have a huge installed base, right? So the reason for that is because they don't really know what the customers need. And you have to just, with all any of these frameworks, just talking about getting practical, you always have to start with deep, deep user empathy.
Absolutely. And so I think now that we've given folks a sense of WTF is up with entrepreneurial frameworks, we're going to say, WTF you should actually do about it in the context of three critical entrepreneurial decisions. So let's start
Yes.
with the classic one here, Omar. And I think coming of age in Silicon Valley, as we did, you couldn't go to a coffee shop back in the day where you didn't hear someone pitching their new app or talking about all the money they raised, Series A, Series B, make it rain. So then here we were entrepreneurs back in the day. And you and I remember discussing like, should we raise venture capital? Is this something where we want to bring on an investor? Do we want to follow in those golden footsteps that we've seen before us? For someone out there who's thinking about, hey, I'm starting a business, is VC the right path for me? How do they make that critical decision, Omar?
Chances are VC is not the path for you nor needed, right? If you have a super high cost venture, high growth, high scale, high revenue potential, I don't know, you need to build a physical space in them, which by the way, I don't think you need VC. You could probably get some small business loans or something, right? Or I don't know, you're in the biotech space and you need to get FDA approval or something like that. Maybe, right? But 0.05% of startups get VC funding. And by the way, so nobody does it, right? Those are the stories we tell, and we hear, and that get amplified. The unicorns, the decacorns, the things that we think are sexy, but it's not the reality on the ground. And by the way, why give up equity and decision making in your venture when you don't necessarily have to? So I just think there's a ton of value to doing what we did, which was bootstrapping, or building as you go, right? You get sales, then that dictates you can make some more investment, right? And by the way, there's so many great loan programs that exist. There's non-dilutive funding you can pursue, and competitions, all kinds of things that are out there, incubators, accelerators. And Jeremy, I never told you this, but I had a friend who was always begging me to invest in our business. He's like, "You guys know what you're doing. There's actually a huge market out here. I want to put money in." I'm like, "I wouldn't even know what to do with your money. We have no cost," right? So could we have made it bigger? For sure. But I think the reality is people get so stuck in like the needing of funding, or funding at a certain level, or even needing that stamp of approval. And sometimes they just don't do stuff, right? Because they're like, I need a certain thing before I can get going. Well, no. Think about your downside, minimize your downside with what you already have. Forget funding, right? If you were able to raise $0, how much would you be willing to put in? And I just think the reality is most people don't need nor even pursue VC.
First of all, those stats are shocking. Again, if you just watch Silicon Valley, the TV show, or read about all this stuff in TechCrunch, you would think everyone is doing VC. So I love the fact that you reframed it around the reality of this is what the world really looks like. And then number two, I think it comes back to an even more important question, which we addressed in last week's episode, which is why do you want to be an entrepreneur in the first place? Is it purely the vanity and the status of saying, oh, I started something? Or maybe you're seeking freedom. Maybe you're seeking a little more autonomy in your life because we know that's a human desire from all of the research. And so then the reality is, are you substituting your current boss at the office for your new boss, the VC? And one of the dark sides that I have to say I've seen firsthand here in the Valley is so often companies end up going in all these crazy directions, trying to grow for growth's sake just to please their VC masters, when in fact, the only reason they started the business in the first place was because they wanted to do things their way. And so if you can keep that North Star in front of your eyes, even when the dollar signs are dancing, I think you're going to make smarter decisions moving forward. Okay.
Yeah.
That is the first dilemma. Anything you want to add there, Omar?
I mean, I love that. Just thinking about why you even want to get into this in the first place. And um, entrepreneurship is stressful enough. Why add the stress of people who are controlling the puppet strings, right? If you don't have to. Now, again, at a certain stage, for certain types of ventures, it can be great. It can unlock what you need. Okay, so Jeremy, next and related topic is where we now see 2/3 of all the VC money going, right? Versus just 14% 5 years ago, which is AI, right? AI is eating the world. So another hot topic we got to talk about is, what does the rise of AI mean for entrepreneurs, and specifically some of the ways it helps and hurts?
Yeah. So I think the critical thing here, and this is probably applies to any tool out there, whether it's AI or some fancy new app or whatever, is it going to actually help me achieve my goals? And I think if you read some of Paul Graham's essays about what makes for really great startups, and of course, this is the legendary founder of Y Combinator, who sort of went through this entrepreneurial experience himself back in the 90s. A lot of it is about doing more with less. How does a small startup outcompete a giant corporation? Not by having more capital or more people, but by actually figuring out better ways to just get stuff done. And so, to the extent that AI now enables anyone to be a programmer, a data scientist, a designer, all these things you would have had to hire a small army of people to do back in the day, I love that for entrepreneurs. I love the idea of a small, nimble organization getting a ton of stuff done that even a big organization can't. However, I think you hinted at the dark side, which is so often, especially in the VC soaked world of the Valley, we are all chasing the last big thing. So ever since ChatGPT came out, everyone knows that if they just put AI into the name of their company, they can raise twice as much money. But the question is, should you actually be an AI company? Like if you are running an arcade in downtown Mountain View, do you need to be an AI arcade? Or could you just serve people really well the old fashioned way? And so I do want our listeners out there to be really cognizant of, are you chasing AI because it actually helps you get stuff done, or just AI for AI's sake? What's your take, Omar? What are you seeing on the East Coast?
Yeah, I agree. And it's so interesting to have this conversation, this bi-coastal conversation, because I'm not in the belly of the beast where you are anymore. But I think it's similarly to how you see AI working and not working in established enterprises right now, right? It's it's there's this temptation because it's such a compelling technology that can unlock so many things to bolt it on, right? I just got to add it. If I'm not doing let's say we're running a karaoke arcade. I'm not really sure what your business is, Jeremy, in downtown Mountain View and like Tech Haven, right? How can I not use AI, right? But there's a difference between AI as a bolt on and a way to streamline certain processes versus like being an AI company, right? Which we would call frontier entrepreneurship. So don't get overly enamored with AI if it's not your core business. And secondly, if you are an AI business, which I see a ton of young entrepreneurs pursuing because as you said, it's an accelerant, it's easier to get started, the costs are generally lower. But if you are doing that, it's not it's not an excuse to outsource a bunch of business processes or even your core differentiated advantage to technology, right? It actually is just like AI in the enterprise and bigger companies, which enables you to do a lot more, right? So I think we both agree it cannot be used as an excuse or a crutch on any level, which is to say, do more because more is now possible, right? So
Yeah.
it's a question of like, well, really, what do you uniquely add into your business? What is your birds in hand? And there's so many things that are valuable about it and streamline processes, running quick tests, as I was talking about earlier. But then how are you adding value on everything else on the human side? Can you sharpen your selling skills, right? So we know now every venture is a tech venture, but human insights, deep empathy are really important. Maybe you don't need a technical co-founder anymore. And I see lots of businesses like this, but you still have to sell to humans who have to make that purchasing decision. And that is something that AI can't do for you. So just remember, what do you bring to?
Yeah. And so, what do you think about this idea? And this is a little bit of an offshoot of what we just discussed of the rise of the 10-person unicorn, 10-person billion-dollar company, where back in the day, it might have taken 1,000 people to reach that kind of run rate. But now, theoretically, through the leverage of AI, you have one business person, one tech person, one design person, and you just massively leverage up your skill set. Do you think that's realistic, or is that more Valley hype speak, Omar?
Well, this is something that's being hyped on both coasts because I hear a lot about this too. And I think the lure is very strong, right? And it's understandable. What I haven't seen is the proof. Like, have we seen that yet? I mean, we ChatGPT launched 3 years ago. So where is that? Where is that company? I'm not saying it's not possible. And I do think that lots of people are realizing, okay, we can do more with less, right? Now, and that is just the reality. And you have the rise of like all these fractional roles too, right? It's not just like little business processes you can outsource. Like you bring in people to manage certain parts of it and they're working super part-time and they're doing this on multiple things. And maybe it's just for a short amount of time. I do think that also like is part of the new gig economy that we're just in now. So like, I think that's real on the ground. What I haven't seen is like highly successful venture that is able to do that at scale without humans. Now, will we get there? Maybe. What do you think, Jeremy?
Yeah, I think it's definitely one of those holy grail things, at least from the VC perspective, because they're salivating over more ownership stake for themselves. That being said, I do think that one of the things that we also share with job seekers, I think this goes to your point around relationships, is that at the end of the day, as long as we are still in control of this planet and not Skynet or not the singularity, it's going to come back to those human things that matter, which are often very manual. You can't just scale up relationships or scale up networking. That's got to go one person at a time. And so I do think there probably are some natural human laws that limit the pure scale available here. But as with all of our episodes, we're going to put a pin in this, come back a year from now, see how our predictions are panning out. But before we get there, there's one last topic I want to address because, in some ways, this is the most pernicious. When I talk to job seekers, especially in this terrible job market, and I say, hey, what about entrepreneurship? What about just starting something on the side to build a little freedom for yourself and your family? They say, oh, I would love to, Jeremy, but I don't have the time. I can't work 80 hours a week. I can't do hustle culture because that's just not realistic for me. So, implicit in that kind of statement, Omar, is the idea that to be a successful entrepreneur, you have to be an endlessly busy entrepreneur. True or false? Is hustle culture a critical component of being a winning entrepreneur?
I have a VC friend who says, "Hustle, don't grind," as if that at that point at which you're grinding versus just
Wait,
hustling.
you have to unpack that a little bit. What does that even mean?
It means grinding is frictionful, right? It means I'm not making progress. I'm just putting in the hours and I don't really see why versus like just hustling, right? Which is, I think we can all agree, a core skill set or at least a mindset of entrepreneurs. But
Well, this feels like such a VC thing, though, right?
totally.
If you're sitting back just handing out checks, of course you're hustling. Why would you ever experience friction? Your entire life is one lubricated journey from a networking event to a smooth pass.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but I want to know what you think because we do see all these possible shortcuts that you can take, right? Is there still a place for hustle culture? And Jeremy, I remember when we worked together in a full-time job, you were so good about every day when you would leave the office, 5 o'clock sharp, you would lock up that computer in your desk and go home, right? It was pretty clear message like, I'm not taking this shit home with me. But guess what? You were brilliant and an amazing at your job and got promoted. So, I think that maybe is a mentality that worked for you, but you're also like top 0.00001% of talented people in the world.
Well, I think that one of the things that I have learned the hard way, and this goes back to our discussion about entrepreneurship last week, the idea of getting caught up in the trappings of being an entrepreneur from business cards to going to networking events and all that, is that I think that if you boil down what really makes an entrepreneur successful, as with everything in life, it comes back to the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule. And I suspect that behind Apple, Google, Microsoft, name any successful entrepreneur in history, even though we get caught up in, oh, their logo is so cool and they have these amazing events, probably 80% of the entire $1 trillion value today comes down to a handful of things they did back in the day, a handful of decisions. And so I guess the question is, and I know Paul Graham really feels strongly that you have to work super hard. You have to compress years of your working life into like just months of innovation. Can you, at the time that you are working on a new business, get down to that 20% of stuff that really matters and start to push away the other stuff that doesn't? Or is that only available in retrospect when you look back upon the trajectory of your career? What do you think, Omar? Is that realistic?
Well, I guess my question to you is how do you know what that 20% is?
Right,
Right. And
right.
how do you know other than just to try a bunch of shit, i.e., work hard?
Yeah, yeah.
So here's what I think. I think, you know, it's funny that entrepreneurs are the only people who are willing to trade 40-hour work weeks for a boss for 80-hour work weeks. I still think that you have to do that, right? Regardless of AI, regardless of all the new efficiencies that we have, because the thing about entrepreneurship is that it's both lumpy and bumpy.
Okay, what does that mean? What's lumpy versus bumpy about?
So, bumpy, meaning there aren't just bumps in the road, the bumps are the road. That is entrepreneurship, right? Lumpy, meaning you don't always see progress in a straight line. It tends to happen in chunks, it tends to happen in little bunches. And if the failure rate is 90%, that promise of the 10% success is just around the corner. It's not even for just your venture overall, it's for whatever you're doing to develop that venture. It could be finding the right product or finding a better killer feature. It could be fundraising and getting that next investor, right? That 10% is always around the corner. And so my thing is you don't know that unless you're really turning over every stone. And it's not to say that you should grind versus hustle, right? It's not to say focusing on things that don't matter. I think you're totally right. You got to continually interrogate that. And by the way, let customer insights dictate that, right? When you nerd out on the problem and are really empathetic about customers, what they're willing to pay for with, that you're solving for them that requires an aspirin, not just a vitamin, that stuff can all help you running quick tests, all the stuff we've been talking about. That can help you figure out what's most important. But I don't see a substitute. I don't want people to think, hey, if it's not working, it's just not working and I got to call it, right? The history of entrepreneurship is littered with so many ventures that have ultimately been successful that started off at totally something totally different, right? And you just don't know that unless you're really committed to finding out. And that's the piece that I just don't want people to take away is like, I can take shortcuts. I'm just wary of shortcuts in life. At the same time, I don't think you have to be totally sacrificial. One of the things I hear a lot from entrepreneurs is just where does my life begin and where does my venture stop, right? And I think that can be really hard, right? Because you're working all the time. There's always more you could do. And so I do think it's important to like tend to yourself and make sure that you are not forgetting about that. But the problem that I see is too many people now thinking this should be an easy
Mhm.
or comparatively effortless path. And I don't necessarily need to scrap anymore. Right.
It
And
was like your
that isn't
dad joke at the beginning, right? Just sit back, let the passive income roll in while you sip your pina colada.
that's not this path, right? This is not a path of least resistance. This is not a path because you couldn't get another 9 to 5 job. This is not a path because you think there's a huge market opportunity for something and you have the killer idea. This is a path that you should pursue if you have a passionate purpose, right? That missionary versus mercenary mindset. The only way you can hustle, grind, whatever you want to call it, sustainably is if you have that true connection to what you're doing, and I don't wanna ever tell aspiring entrepreneurs that it isn't gonna require that kind of commitment.
Well said. Well, I think this is the perfect segue to next week's episode when we start to talk about how AI is not just affecting entrepreneurs, but affecting the next generation of entrepreneurs, Gen Z new grads hitting the job market and facing a really tough moment. And so, Omar, I am excited to dive in with you next week. But in the meantime, what can people do to spread the word about WTF is up?
Smash that subscribe or follow, and please rate us. And remember that FAIL stands for first attempt in learning.
Oh my goodness. Okay. I'm going to have that sort of burned into my retinas for the rest of my entrepreneurial career. And on that note, this is WTF is Up with Jeremy and Omar. And that is what is up, my friends. Have a great week, everyone.